but the cold still cut into skin and bone, their breath forming small white clouds in the air. Scarlett carried Ethan in her arms and led Sophie beside her, and they walked toward the Mercy Street shelter. It was where she and the children had lived for 3 months before the shelter filled up and they were forced back onto the street. It was where people had helped her when she had nothing, and now, for the first time, she could help them in return. The Mercy Street shelter sat in an old brick building that had once been a church, before it was renovated into a place of refuge for the homeless. When Scarlett stepped inside, the cold from within struck her in the face. The heating system was broken. She remembered Margaret saying that, and in 10 below January in Chicago, that meant life or death. Margaret Chen stood at the front desk, her 55-year-old face carved with worry, dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights. When she saw Scarlett, she hurried over and wrapped her in a tight hug, like she was holding a daughter she'd lost. "Scarlett, where were you? I worried all night. The shelter was full and I couldn't." I know, Scarlett said, gently patting her back. "I'm okay. The kids are okay. But Margaret, the heating." Margaret let out a tired sigh, exhaustion written across her face. The repairman quoted $4,200. "I don't have that kind of money. I've called everywhere looking for emergency funding, but no one can help right away. Last night, 3 people got hypothermia. I had to send them to the hospital." Scarlett pulled the black card from her coat pocket. "Call the repairman right now. I'll pay." Margaret stared at the card, then at Scarlett, doubt filling her eyes. Where did you? Please don't ask," Scarlett said softly, but with steel in her tone. "Just know someone helped me, and now I want to pass that help forward. That's what my mother taught me." The repair team arrived within an hour. They worked quickly, and when the heating system rumbled back to life, warmth spread through the shelter, and Scarlett saw faces around her loosen with relief. She swiped the card, $4,200, and no one would freeze to death tonight. After that, she went to find Harold Patterson. The 73-year-old veteran sat curled in a corner, his face pale, his hands trembling. He hadn't had his diabetes medicine in 2 weeks, and Scarlett knew his body was wearing down day by day. She sat beside him, pressed the bag of medicine she'd bought the night before into his hand, and told him she would buy more, enough to last 6 months. Harold stared at the medicine, then at Scarlett, his old eyes filling with tears. Where did this come from? I've got nothing to pay you back." "You don't need to pay anything," Scarlett said, her voice thick. "You shared half of your last piece of bread with Sophie last week. You told the kids stories every night so they could forget they were hungry. You gave when you had nothing. Now it's my turn," Harold cried, tears running down the lines of his wrinkled face, and he gripped Scarlett's hand like he was holding on to life itself. "You saved my life," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You saved my life." Scarlett hugged him, let him cry against her shoulder, and she cried too. But these were tears of happiness, of being able to give, of being able to do what was right. After that, she called the pharmacy and placed an order for 6 months of diabetes medication, asking them to deliver it to the shelter. $1,890. At 9 in the morning, Scarlett stood in the shelter kitchen, cooking breakfast for 35 people. She had gone to a nearby grocery store and bought eggs, bread, butter, jam, bacon, fresh fruit, milk, orange juice, and coffee. $420. She scrambled eggs, fried bacon, toasted bread, brewed coffee, and laid everything out on the long wooden tables in the dining room. Sophie helped her set out plates, while Ethan sat at the end of the long table, waving at everyone with a wide grin. When the homeless residents began lining up for food, Scarlett stood behind the serving counter, spooning eggs onto plates, placing slices of meat, and giving each person a smile. Margaret stood beside her, watching Scarlett with eyes full of shock and emotion. "Where did you get this money?" she asked again, her voice a whisper. Scarlett paused, looked at her, and smiled. "Someone gave me a blessing, Margaret. And my mother taught me that when you receive a blessing, you don't keep it for yourself. You let it flow through you to others. Today I'm the bridge, that's all." Margaret didn't ask again. She only held Scarlett tight, and in that warm embrace, Scarlett felt her mother smiling from somewhere very far away. Marcus Blackwood didn't sleep. All night long he sat in his office on the top floor of the Obsidian, his eyes locked on his phone screen, waiting for each transaction alert like a hawk stalking prey. His third whiskey had been empty for a long time, and dawn was slipping through the heavy curtains, but he didn't bother to stand and open the window. He just sat there, watching the list of transactions grow minute by minute, and felt something strange stirring inside his chest. At 9 a.m, Tony walked into the office with a cup of hot coffee. He looked at his boss, saw immediately that Marcus hadn't closed his eyes for even a minute, and set the coffee on the desk without a word. Marcus didn't look up. He only slid the phone across the desk toward Tony. "Read it," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. Tony took the phone and scrolled through the transaction list. CVS Pharmacy, $847. Lucky Star Motel, $79. McDonald's, $15. Heating repair service, $4,200. Walgreens Pharmacy, $1,890. Walmart Grocery, $420. He read it again and again, as if he couldn't trust his own eyes. "A total of $7,451, Marcus said, his voice flat, but something deeper lived beneath it. Maybe confusion, maybe suspicion, maybe a thin spark of hope he didn't dare admit. "And how much did she spend on herself, Tony? How much?" Tony was silent for a long time. "Nothing, nothing," Marcus repeated, as if he were trying to swallow an alien concept. "She has an unlimited card in her hand. She can buy anything in this world. And she goes and fixes the heating system for a shelter. She buys medicine for an old man she doesn't owe a thing to. She cooks breakfast for 35 homeless people." He stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the city slowly waking under winter sunlight. 12 years in the underworld. 12 years watching people betray, deceive, and kill for money. He'd seen fathers sell their children, wives sell their husbands, friends sell their souls. He'd seen the worst a human being could do. And now a homeless woman was making everything he believed feel meaningless. "Maybe she's acting," Marcus said, but his voice didn't carry the confidence he wanted. "Maybe she knows she's being watched and she's trying to impress me. She doesn't know the card is being tracked," Tony said gently. "You didn't tell her that." Marcus turned, his eyes sharp on Tony. "Then what is she doing? Why? Why would someone with nothing give everything away?" Tony set the phone down on the desk and looked straight into his boss's eyes. He was one of the few people who dared. "Maybe because she's a good person, Marcus. Maybe because not everyone has a price." He paused, then asked a question that froze Marcus in place. "When was the last time you helped someone with nothing in it for you?" Silence stretched across the room. Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't, because he didn't remember, because maybe the answer was never. Everything he'd done in his life had a purpose, had calculation, had profit hidden underneath. He helped people because they could help him back. He gave to charity because it helped launder money and polish his image. He had never given anything without wanting something in return. Tony stood, ready to leave. "I think you should meet her. Not as a mafia boss, as a normal man. Maybe you'll see something you forgot a long time ago." Marcus watched Tony walk out, then turned back to the city beyond the glass. A decision formed in his mind, not because he wanted to prove her wrong, but because for the first time in many years, he wanted to understand. He wanted to know why. He wanted to see with his own eyes the person shaking everything he'd ever believed. "I'm going to see for myself," he whispered to himself. "Pretend I'm a stranger. Find out who she really is." At 12 noon, Riverside Park along the Chicago River was quieter than usual. The snow had stopped falling early that morning, but the cold was still there, sharp enough that most people chose to stay indoors instead of going out. But for Scarlett, the park was a free kind of heaven, a place where the children could run and laugh without anyone chasing them away. After a busy morning at the shelter, she brought Sophie and Ethan here so they could breathe fresh air and be kids for a little while. On the way, she'd stopped at a thrift store and bought each of them a warmer coat, $67 for both. Not new, but thick enough to block the wind and clean enough to wear without shame. Sophie chose a pale pink one. Ethan loved a blue one with a bear on the back. Watching them in their new coats as they ran toward the swings, Scarlett felt her heart warm even though the air was freezing. Marcus arrived at the park 10 minutes earlier. He wore jeans and an ordinary leather jacket, not his expensive suit, not the polished leather shoes he usually wore. He pulled a baseball cap low to hide his face and sat on a bench near the swing set with a newspaper in his hands. The paper was only a cover. His eyes weren't reading a single word. They were following the auburn-haired woman and the 2 children who had just stepped into the park. He recognized her instantly, even though she looked refreshed and her worn clothes had been carefully cleaned and dried overnight. There was something different in the way she smiled at her children, in the way she pushed Sophie on the swing, in the way she caught Ethan as the little boy slid down the slide. She was smiling, and it wasn't like any smile Marcus had ever seen. No calculation, no purpose, only the pure joy of a mother watching her children be happy. Ethan walked slowly from the slide toward his mother, his steps still a bit unsteady from the fever. He was looking at his mother and laughing, but in his excitement, he tripped on a tree root jutting up through the earth. Marcus moved on instinct. He rose, stepped forward, and caught the boy before he could fall face first into the snow. Ethan looked up, wide-eyed with surprise, then grinned as if he'd just been part of a fun game. "Thank you, sir," the boy said, his voice bright. Scarlett hurried over, her expression caught between worry and caution. She could tell this man wasn't the one she'd seen the night before. In ordinary clothes, he looked completely different, but there was something in those deep black eyes that felt strangely familiar. "I'm sorry," she said, taking Ethan from Marcus's hands. "He runs around without watching where he's going." "It's fine," Marcus answered, his voice softer than he expected. "He's healthy, just a small stumble." "I'm Scarlett," she said, not sure why she was introducing herself to a stranger, but there was something in his gaze that made her want to speak. "Michael," Marcus said, the false name sliding off his tongue with ease. "I come here to read sometimes." By then, Sophie had left the swings and walked over to stand beside her mother. She looked at Marcus with eyes as green as her mother's, but far older than her years. She held his gaze without blinking, without looking away, and then she said something that made Marcus feel as if someone had punched him in the chest. "You're really sad, aren't you?" Scarlett sucked in a sharp breath, ready to scold her daughter for asking a stranger something like that, but Marcus lifted a hand to stop her, his eyes still fixed on the 6-year-old who was looking at him as if she could see straight through his soul. "Why do you think that?" he asked, his voice rough. Sophie tilted her head, thought for a moment, then answered, "Because your eyes look like Mom's eyes after Dad died. Really sad. But Mom has me and Ethan, so she's less sad now." "Do you have anyone?" Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't, because the innocent question from a 6-year-old had torn through every layer of armor he'd built over 12 years. Did he have anyone? He had Tony, but Tony was a subordinate. He had hundreds of people working for him, but they followed him for money. He had Chicago's underworld empire, but an empire couldn't hold him when he was alone in the middle of the night. "I'm sorry," Scarlett said, pulling Sophie closer. "My daughter is too blunt. She didn't mean anything by it." Marcus shook his head slowly, his eyes still on Sophie with something close to awe. "Don't apologize. She's smart. She sees what adults can't see." He paused, then added, his voice a whisper, as if he were speaking to himself. "Or don't dare to see." After the short conversation in the park, Marcus realized he didn't want to leave. There was something about this woman and the 2 children that made him want to stay, want to watch a little longer, want to understand more. When Scarlett said she was planning to take the kids to the public library because Sophie loved books, he offered to walk with them, saying he was headed that way too. Scarlett hesitated for a moment. The wary instinct of a single mother didn't make it easy to trust a stranger. But then Sophie took Marcus's hand and said, "Mr. Michael, come with us. I'll show you the best book." And Scarlett couldn't bring herself to refuse her daughter's smile. They walked together along the snow-covered sidewalk, Sophie holding one hand of her mother and one hand of Marcus, while Ethan sat on Marcus's shoulders because he said his legs were tired. Marcus couldn't remember the last time he'd carried a child, maybe never, but the warm weight of Ethan on his shoulders brought a strange feeling. A feeling of belonging, a feeling of peace he thought he'd forgotten long ago. The Harold Washington Public Library sat downtown, a massive building with soaring columns and thousands of books lined up on oak shelves. Sophie ran straight into the children's section, her eyes bright as if she'd stepped into heaven. Scarlett led Ethan in behind her, and Marcus walked beside them, watching everything in silence. He watched Scarlett sit and read to her daughter, her voice soft and full of love. He watched Sophie turn each page with the care of someone holding a treasure. He watched Ethan curl up in his mother's lap and drift off to sleep, his breathing steady now, no longer wheezing like the night before, the medicine already doing its work. Then Scarlett stood and walked toward the front desk. Marcus followed, curious. She spoke to the librarian and asked about the book donation program for poor children she had seen on a flyer posted by the door. The librarian explained the library was trying to collect 500 books to give to elementary schools in lower-income neighborhoods, but the program was short on funding. Scarlett didn't say much. She simply pulled out the black card and asked how much money it would take to buy all 500 books. $3,000, the librarian answered, startled. Scarlett nodded and swiped the card. Marcus stood behind her watching it happen and felt something inside his chest begin to crack. As they left the library, Scarlett's phone rang. She answered, and her face went pale. It was Margaret from the shelter, calling to say the Morrison family, Linda and her 3 small children, had just received a final notice from their landlord. They had to pay 4 months of rent within 24 hours or be put out on the street. Scarlett didn't hesitate. She asked for Linda's address and took a taxi there immediately. Marcus followed without a word, only watching. Linda Morrison's apartment was in an old building on the south side of the city. When Scarlett walked in, she found Linda sitting on the floor with her 3 small children gathered around her, all of them crying. Their belongings had already been half-packed into torn cardboard boxes. Linda looked up when she saw Scarlett, her eyes red and hopeless. "Scarlett, why are you here?" Scarlett sat down beside Linda, took her hand, and spoke gently, but with quiet certainty. "I'm here to help. How much is 4 months of rent?" Linda stared at her like she was crazy. $5,600. "But Scarlett, you're worse off than I am. You don't have a home. You don't have money. How can you—" Scarlett didn't answer. She only pulled out the card and called the landlord. 10 minutes later, the debt was paid. Linda dropped to her knees in front of Scarlett, sobbing, clutching her hands like she was holding on to life. "Why are you helping me? Why? You don't owe me anything. You're suffering more than I am." Scarlett pulled Linda up and held her close. "Because I know what it feels like to lose your home. Because I know what it feels like to watch your children cry and not be able to do anything. Someone helped me, and now I'm helping you. Someday, when you can, help someone else. That's how it works." Marcus stood outside the doorway, his back against the wall, and for the first time in 12 years, he felt his eyes burn. On the way back, they came across a man named Robert, standing beside a car that wouldn't start, his face desperate because he couldn't afford repairs and he would lose his job if he couldn't get to work. Scarlett paid $1,200 to a mechanic without saying a word. Robert cried and thanked her, and Scarlett only smiled and told him to get to work before he was late. Marcus watched her, and for the first time, he didn't see an experiment. He saw a person better than anyone he'd ever met in his life, and that terrified him more than any bullet that had ever been aimed at him. By 6 in the evening, the winter sunset had been gone for hours, and Chicago lay under a cold darkness. Scarlett, Marcus, and the 2 children sat in a small roadside coffee shop, the kind of plain place with old wooden chairs and warm yellow lights. Sophie and Ethan had fallen asleep on the corner sofa, worn out after a long day packed with little adventures. Scarlett watched them with softened eyes, then turned back to the cup of coffee gone cold in front of her. Marcus sat across from her, watching the children too, and a question slipped from his mouth before he could stop it. "Where's their father?" Scarlett didn't flinch, as if she'd been waiting for that question for a long time. She took a sip of coffee, looked out the window where snow had begun to fall again, and started to speak in a low, steady voice. His name was Daniel Hayes. He was a police officer with the Chicago Police Department, working organized crime. She paused and gave a sad smile. He was the best man I ever knew. Not the kind of good that lives in words, but the kind of good that lives in action. He believed in justice. He believed the law could protect the innocent. He believed one person could make a difference. His co-workers used to tease him, call him the last fool who still believed that. Marcus listened, and a strange, familiar feeling began to spread through his chest. An organized crime detective, Chicago. He'd heard of men like that, men who interfered with his business, thorns in his side, the kind he'd often ordered removed without needing to know their names. "What happened?" he asked, his voice lower. He was investigating a big case. He didn't tell me details. He only said it was the most important case of his career, that if he succeeded, he could break a dangerous criminal network. Scarlett stopped, her voice trembling slightly. Then one night he drove home after a late shift. The police said he lost control, hit the median barrier, and rolled over several times. They called it an accident, but you don't believe it. Scarlett shook her head. Daniel drove more carefully than anyone I've ever known. He never drank if he had to drive. He checked the car every week like it was a religious ritual. I knew something was wrong. I knew someone killed him because he dug too deep into what they wanted hidden. But no one listened. I was just a grieving widow, and they wanted to close the file. Marcus felt his throat go dry and bitter. He remembered reports about accidents his people had arranged over the years. He'd never asked for details. He'd never wanted names or faces. To him, they were numbers, problems to be handled. But now, sitting across from a widow and two fatherless children, those numbers started to take shape, to grow voices, to carry pain. "Do you hate them?" he asked, his voice rough. "The ones who did that to your husband." Scarlett looked at him, her green eyes deep as the ocean. "I hated them. God, I hated them so much I wanted them dead. I lay awake at night and imagined 100 ways to find them and make them hurt the way I hurt. I wanted them to lose everything the way I had lost everything. I wanted them to know what it felt like to have the person you love stolen from you. And then one night Sophie woke up from a nightmare and asked me when Dad was coming home, and I looked at her. Looked into those eyes just like Daniel's, and I understood something." Scarlett paused, and her voice softened. "Living in hatred would kill me before I ever managed to kill anyone else. And if I died, who would take care of Sophie and Ethan? Who would tell them about the wonderful father they had? Who would teach them that there is still something good left in this world?" She looked straight into Marcus's eyes. "Daniel wouldn't want me to live in hatred. He would want me to live, to love, and to raise our children into good people. So I let go. Not forgiveness, because I don't think I can forgive the ones who stole my husband from me. But letting go, so the pain wouldn't control me anymore." Marcus sat there, unable to speak. In 12 years as king of the underworld, he'd heard endless threats, pleas, and flattery. But he had never heard anyone speak about letting go like this. He had never heard anyone speak about release with strength and peace. Victoria betrayed him, and he'd spent 5 years hating her. His father beat him, and he'd spent his whole life trying to prove him wrong. But Scarlett, who had lost more than he ever had, chose to let go. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met," Marcus whispered, and for the first time in his life, he meant it with no motive hiding underneath. After the conversation in the coffee shop, Marcus said he had to leave because something urgent had come up. But the truth was, he needed time alone to process what he'd just heard. He watched Scarlett wake the children, watched the way she gently smoothed Sophie's hair and kissed Ethan's forehead. Then he turned away and stepped into the night with his heart heavy. Scarlett didn't try to hold him there. She only smiled and said, "Thank you for coming with us today, Michael." And that false name hit Marcus like a knife to the chest. He nodded, unable to look her in the eyes, and disappeared into the crowd. But Scarlett didn't go back to the motel to rest. She still had work to do, and time was running out. At 8 in the evening, she brought the children to the Mercy Street shelter, asked Margaret to watch them for a little while, then went straight to the nearest clothing store. She bought 20 warm coats for children, sizes ranging from 4 years old to 12 years old, for a total of $1,800. When she carried the stack of coats back to the shelter and handed them out to children shivering in the cold, their laughter rang out like music in the winter night. One little boy hugged a blue coat tight to his chest and said, "I've never had a new coat." And Scarlett had to turn her face away so he wouldn't see her crying. At 9 in the evening, on her way back, Scarlett passed Chicago Memorial Hospital, where she used to work. A memory flashed through her, and she decided to go inside, not to revisit the past, but because she remembered the patients who couldn't afford their bills, the people whose medical records were held up because of debt, the people forced to choose between health and food. She went to the front desk and asked if anyone needed help. The receptionist stared at her in surprise, then called the finance office. 10 minutes later, they brought Scarlett to meet an 80-year-old woman lying in a hospital room, alone, with no family, owing $8,000 for a hip surgery. The woman's name was Martha, her hair white as snow, her eyes cloudy, and yet a spark still lit them when she saw Scarlett step in. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice weak. Scarlett sat down beside the bed and took the woman's wrinkled hand in hers. "I'm the person who's going to help you go home," she said gently. She swiped the card, $8,000, and watched Martha's face brighten through tears. "Why?" Martha asked, her voice trembling. "Why would you help an old stranger like me?" Scarlett smiled. "Because you're not a stranger. You're a human being, and human beings should help each other. That's the only thing that means anything in this world." 11:55 at night. Scarlett stood in front of the obsidian, where everything had begun. Snow fell lightly, white flakes drifting in the yellow glow of the club sign. Sophie and Ethan were sleeping soundly back at the motel, with Margaret watching them, and Scarlett came here alone. She saw a flower vendor huddled by the curb, the basket almost empty because no one was buying in the cold night. Scarlett walked over and bought a red rose for $5, the last rose in the basket. The vendor looked at her with gratitude, then hurried to pack up and run home to escape the cold. Scarlett stood under the obsidian's overhang, the exact spot where she'd sat with her children the night before, and placed the rose on the ground. She pulled out the note she'd written in the motel, folded it, and set it beside the rose, weighing it down with a small stone so the wind wouldn't take it. Then she stood, looked up at the top floor of the club where the lights were still on, and whispered, "Thank you, sir," before turning away and disappearing into the falling snow. Marcus arrived 10 minutes later. He'd been watching her through the club's security cameras. He'd seen her stop. He'd seen her place something down. He stepped outside, the cold striking his face, and walked to where the rose lay on the snow. He picked up the note, opened it, and read beneath the dim yellow light. "To the person who gave me 24 hours of hope. I don't know who you are or why you did this, but I want you to know I kept nothing for myself. Not because I didn't need it. I need so much, but because I believe that when we give, we receive more. Thank you for giving me the chance to prove that. I will repay you, not with money, but by continuing to give." Scarlett. Marcus stood there, the paper trembling in his hand, and for the first time in 12 years, tears rolled down the face of Chicago's coldest mafia boss. $27,123. She had spent $27,123 of his money, and not a single cent on herself. He had wanted to prove that everyone had a price, that everyone would become selfish when given the chance. But this woman had proven him wrong, completely wrong. And that wrongness was crushing everything he had ever believed. 3 days had passed since that night of 24 miraculous hours. Scarlett had returned to normal life. If you could call a homeless life normal, she and the children were still at the Mercy Street shelter, now much warmer thanks to the repaired heating system. The black card had stopped working exactly the way the stranger said it would, and Scarlett wasn't sad about it. She had done what she wanted to do. She had helped the people she cared about, and that mattered more than any amount of money. She still thought about the man who had given her the card, about why he'd done it, but she had no answers, and she didn't know where to look. She also thought about Michael, the man she met in the park, the one who walked with her for an entire day and listened while she talked about Daniel. There was something about him that made her feel connected. A deep sadness in his dark eyes that she recognized because she had once worn that same look herself. That afternoon, Scarlett was helping Margaret clean the shelter's common room when the old television on the wall clicked on to the evening news. A few homeless residents sat watching, mostly to pass the time rather than because they truly cared about the headlines. Scarlett didn't pay attention. She was wiping down tables and straightening chairs, her mind on finding a new job so she could rent a room for herself and the kids. Then a voice rose from the television area, the voice of a middle-aged man who lived at the shelter. "Hey, look at that. Marcus Blackwood, that mafia boss. I worked at his club a few years back." Scarlett lifted her head on instinct, and her world froze. On the TV screen, in a report about Chicago's underground economy, was Michael's face. "No, not Michael. Marcus Blackwood," the anchor said. "The most powerful boss in Chicago's underworld, owner of dozens of businesses, including the nightclub The